Hey friends, SGT here, and before we listen to this interview with my good friend Harley Schlanger, I just want to give you a brief update. I want to thank every single person who's taken the time to reach out, and so many of you have, and you know who you are, and I can't thank you enough for your kindness. There's a lot going on behind the scenes that I can't talk about right now, but I'm sure there will be much more to share in the coming weeks ahead. I want to apologize for the bad audio on my part of the recording in this interview with Harley. I plugged some stuff in incorrectly, so my voice is only picked up by my laptop mic. Again, I want to thank each and every one of you for your support. Without your kindness, this would have been a much more difficult time. Enjoy the interview, and thanks. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I want to thank my normal contributor, Rory, who cannot be with us today. He's out enjoying a special day, and we wish him well. I'll tell you what, when times get tough, you find out who your real friends are, and thank God, and I do. I have lots of them. I'm very blessed to have on the phone today my dear friend, Harley Schlanger, who really needs no introduction, and he is truly one of my favorite people with such a grasp on history and such a grasp on current events. He is a friend of liberty. Harley, welcome.
Hi, Sean. Good to be with you.
Well, it's good to have you, sir. How have you been? We haven't spoken in a couple of months, and I know things are changing quickly in the Glass-Steagall area, and we want to talk about that. What have you been up to?
Well, it's been a busy period. We're involved right now in a major mobilization to try and get something done in the Congress before they recess for the summer. And of course, we see all kinds of craziness coming from the administration. And a lot of my friends are saying, well, why go to the Congress? The Congress has been dysfunctional. But what we're beginning to see is across party lines, people coming together on key issues, whether it's a Glass-Steagall bill, whether it's a fight against the FSA, or FISA rather, the NSA wiretapping, or the Syrian war. We're seeing Republicans and Democrats put aside their partisan disagreements and join in a battle against this administration. So it's been very busy for me trying to stay ahead of that and move it in the right direction.
Well, people are waking up, and I do later in the show. I want to talk to you about Syria, what's happening in Egypt, get your take on who our government is supporting in both of those countries, and what it means to global freedom, what it means to the global struggle for liberty, what it means to our own struggle in our own nation for liberty. This first segment is very short. We're going to break here in about 90 seconds. Just briefly level set for people about the Glass-Steagall situation, because Tom Harkin's S-985 was the original bill to reinstate the original Glass-Steagall. And now I think there's this one from a group of senators led by Elizabeth Warren and John McCain, which has me on my heels because I'm not a big fan of John McCain's, called the 21st Century Glass-Steagall Act. Maybe we should talk about that when we get back. We have about 60 seconds.
Well, yeah, I can talk about it. The main thing that's important is that there's now a demand for a separation of banking, which 2 years ago there wasn't, and we've created that. The particular bill, I don't think, answers the problem, especially when it says for the 21st century. That means they're accepting the last 40 years of monetarism and Federal Reserve manipulations, which I don't think should be included. So there's certainly room to talk about that, but I think we've changed the discussion in this country to recognize that Dodd-Frank and these other so-called reforms are no damn good.
And for anyone to whom this is new, if they don't understand Glass-Steagall and why you and I are talking about it, can you help them understand what it is and why it was created back in, 1933?
Yeah, 1933. The importance of Glass-Steagall is that what has been done by the financial oligarchs whenever they have the opportunity is that they have a monopoly on credit generation through the Federal Reserve since 1913. And they create an environment where money will flow for the quickest profit, regardless of the needs of the economy. And when it's completely unregulated, as it was in the 20s, huge amounts of money went into speculation. There were no restrictions on what the banks could do, and they built up a huge bubble. And some of the people in the banks knew what was going to pop, and they pulled out, and they survived. But the nation and the world was plunged into a depression. What Franklin Roosevelt did by supporting a bill by a senator and a House member, Carter Glass and Henry Steagall, is that they created a bill which said that never again will investment banks have access to commercial bank deposits to engage in speculation. And that established a system that worked from 1933 through the mid-'80s without being really touched. And we didn't have a banking crisis during that whole period of time. In fact, what we had was continued growth, non-inflationary growth of the physical economy. Because when you have that restriction, what it does is it ensures that a certain amount of money from the commercial banks will go into investments in small and medium-sized businesses. It will help fund larger industrial projects, utility districts, and so on, as well as small business, family businesses, and personal accounts. What happened is that a group of bankers centered around Alan Greenspan and J.P. Morgan in the early 80s decided to attack it. And they did it in a series of steps that culminated in 1999 with the full repeal of Glass-Steagall through something called the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. And as a result, it meant that deposits in commercial banks could be used as though it were the personal income of the bankers and traders to go into increasingly risky levels of speculation. And some of this, as your listeners know, happened in the mid to late 80s when the savings and loans were collapsed. And mortgages became subject to speculation through these instruments called mortgage-backed securities. Now, the argument that the Morgan and others had, the bankers had, is that, well, this frees money to go to its highest rate of return. The point is you can't have an economy where all money goes to the highest rate of return because that becomes hyperinflationary, speculative, and it freezes money out of production. And our economy, the United States economy and our Constitution has within it this principle of regulation of interstate commerce to protect small individuals and small businesses from the giant corporations. And what Glass-Steagall did is it opened completely the large corporations to control, almost in the form of a dictatorship, where the money would go. So anyone who argues, well, this had nothing to do with the 2008 crisis is plain and simple an idiot, because the large amounts of funds that were available to investment banks like Lehman Brothers, Merrill Lynch, and others were coming from commercial banks as well as hedge funds, the so-called shadow banking system, and they were buying financial instruments that were being underwritten by the commercial banks. And that's why when the bubble popped in September 2008, it nearly collapsed the whole system. And as you know, Sean, I don't think the bailout was the right thing to do at the time. It may have saved the system, but it also saved all the bad debt and kept it on the books of banks at face value rather than market value. And so we're long overdue for a giant correction because there's over $1 quadrillion of financial derivatives and mortgage-backed securities out in circulation. How do you back up $1 quadrillion in speculative paper? You simply can't. The global GDP is under $50 trillion. Now, what's interesting is that we had initiated, along with several members of Congress in 2010, a fight for Glass-Steagall. It was shut down by the Obama administration. But in the new Congress in January of this year, it was reintroduced by Marcy Kaptur, a Democrat, and Walter Jones, a Republican. And then Tom Harkin put it forward in the U.S. Senate for the original Glass-Steagall. Now we've seen in the last days Elizabeth Warren, John McCain, Maria Cantwell, a Democrat from Washington State, and Angus King, an independent from Maine, put forward a Glass-Steagall for the 21st century. And what Lyndon LaRouche said on this is he doesn't trust the motives of these people, especially since Elizabeth Warren continues to say, let's give Dodd-Frank more time. Secondly, this bill says it's 5 years before it would be implemented. The important thing about it is that it does reflect a sense of key people in the Senate as well as the House that we can't continue the way things are going, that we're not really in a recovery at all. Right. But the problem is the urgency about the effects of the collapse of the real economy is not causing people to take measures that are commensurate with the collapse to protect us against it. And so the bankers still have all the wiggle room in the world. And the last thing you want is a banker with wiggle room.
Right. So what we're seeing is this quote-unquote bipartisan group of senators led by a Democrat from Massachusetts and John McCain, a Republican from Arizona, to introduce this quote-unquote 21st century Glass-Steagall Act, but they didn't get behind Tom Harkin's S-985, which was really re-implementing the original bulletproof Glass-Steagall. So I hear what you're saying in that, okay, we're finally seeing senators from both sides of the aisle having to at least acknowledge the problems and at least pay some, fancy footwork to it. But what I would like to do, if you don't mind, Harley, we have 7 minutes before break, what I would like to do is step back into that Wayback Machine. You took us back to 1933 at my request to help us understand Glass-Steagall and why, it needed to be implemented and why it was created. And it was in response to what the banks did to get us into the Great Depression. And but I think we need to go a little bit back further in that Wayback Machine for new listeners to help us understand, Harley, why things spun out of control from, say, 1913, and that's a very important date for many reasons. People know why, which I'm sure you'll share with us in a second. From 1913 to 1933. In 1910, a very powerful group of men met on an island, Jekyll Island, and over the next 3 years, they were able to roll out a very insidious plan, which I think came to fruition in 1913. Can you help people understand what it is I'm getting at?
Sure. I mean, look, the history of the United States is a constant fight between those patriots who realize that we have to have a government that protects individuals from huge private interests versus the people of those private interests. Now, what you're referring to in the beginning of the 20th century is that we had under President McKinley a return to the idea of the American system, which includes a protective tariff. Not to put tariffs on everything, but on certain things which are necessary to protect our economy. McKinley also had tax policies and policies to fund the physical economy. But what happened is there was also a large speculative push coming from Wall Street at the time, which included especially the Morgan Bank, and it was directed in part internationally for the City of London and the Warburg interests in Germany and so on. And what happened is that in 1907, there was a near crash of the financial system. And over a period of several months, Morgan basically bailed out the United States. He guaranteed the dollar, in return for which he extracted a pledge that there would be a private central bank created to do what he had done in the future. But that private central bank would have the basis of determining the flow of currency, credit, and debt to the U.S. economy in strict violation of Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which reserves that power to the Congress. And so, as you mentioned, the secret meetings which culminated on Jekyll Island pulled together a proposal which we've had to live with now for 100 years. It'll be 100 years in December that the Federal Reserve System has been here, which gives to private bankers, in fact, a handful of about 6 or 8 banks, the full power over determining U.S. credit and debt policy. And they do it through marketing government bonds and making money on it. So that it's not even under a national banking system, money that's made, if the economy's going well, on bonds goes back to the Treasury, back to the people, not to private bankers. And secondly, under a national banking system, you would not have speculation of those bonds. But now you have private interests that buy and sell nations. That's what we see in Europe. I've been in Europe a lot, and the European Union not only takes away sovereignty from nations, but they just decreed that there will be a single banking union under the control of bureaucrats in Brussels, who are under the control of the City of London and Wall Street. They will dictate to every single nation of Europe whether they can create credit, whether they can spend money on internal improvements or not, all of which will be done for the benefit of the big banks, who are essentially bankrupt. And you can use Glass-Steagall to put these so-called too big to fail banks into bankruptcy reorganization. You do it very simply. You call them in and you say, let's see what your assets are, your so-called assets and your liabilities. And if they actually present an honest accounting, and by the way, you have to do the honest accounting yourself before you get into the meeting, but then you can say to them, well, look, these are old debts. These are debts with no backing. There's no assets here to back up your liabilities. Gentlemen, you're bankrupt. Now, under the Federal Reserve System, that will never be done because those bankrupt banks control the Federal Reserve System, and Bernanke's just a spokesman for them. So we have to go back to a policy in which the instruments of a national government reflect the interests of the people and therefore act to protect them from this kind of looting.
When we have a conversation about a group of powerful men who met, in Jekyll Island, and when we talk about the Federal Reserve System, which is private, and the Federal Reserve loans money to the Treasury at interest at 6%, I think is in their charter. Have you ever been accused of being anti-Semitic for talking about the Federal Reserve? Because I've got nothing against Jewish people. Some of my best friends are Jewish. What is your take on the label anti-Semitism and talking about the Federal Reserve? And we're going to break here in 90 seconds.
Well, first of all, I'm Jewish. And
I didn't know that, Harley.
I would never do anything.
I told you some of my best friends were Jewish.
But you see, that argument is used to discredit people who have legitimate criticisms of the way the banking system is set up. And it's unfortunate that there's some idiots out there who talk about Jewish bankers conspiracy. There's no Jewish bankers conspiracy. There is, however, a separate set of interests for a small group of bankers, some of whom are Episcopalian, Protestant, Catholic, Jewish. I don't think it's the banks have a religious denomination. Either you have banks that fund physical production or you have banks that loot. And the fact that some banks work together to plan out policies of extreme looting through austerity and manipulation of credit and illegal activities, as we've seen in the last few years with LIBOR and others,
right,
to attack them doesn't make you against a religion.
Right.
It makes you a committed patriot to a sovereign nation state. And that's not anti-Semitism.
Well, thank you for that, Harley. We're all in this mess together, and we truly are as it pertains to trying to get our liberty back from those who seek to take it from us. Now, Harley, I wanted to read this title of an article to you, which I think will tie into some very startling information that you have about J.P. Morgan lobbyists being sent to Delaware. This is from the Daily Ticker on Yahoo Finance, and the title is Bank Lobbyists Gearing Up to Take Down New Glass-Steagall Bill. And in the body of this piece that was released yesterday, Harley, it says, the Daily Ticker asked chief correspondent for Yahoo News if he thinks this bill can pass the Senate. I don't think it will, he says, but lobbyists for the financial services industry seem worried. They certainly seem to be taking it seriously. What is your take on where we're headed with Glass-Steagall, and what's your take on J.P. Morgan and its lobbyists?
Let me start with J.P. Morgan, because that's where you begin to get to the heart of the problem, because Morgan is essentially the interface between Wall Street and the City of London. And the Morgan banking interests, J.P. Morgan himself was responsible for in large part, for the establishment of the Federal Reserve. His son, J.P. Morgan Jr., was called before the Pecora Commission and forced to admit that while this was the commission set up to investigate the crimes of the banks during the 20s and early 30s, he was forced to admit that he paid no taxes. While his bank was expropriating farms, using utility rates to bankrupt housing and farmers and small businesses. This is a family that also was part of the grouping, along with the Bush family and the Harrimans, that were supporting the Nazis in the 1930s, supporting Hitler. And it was the Morgan interests that were behind the attempted coup against Franklin Roosevelt that coalesced around General Smedley Butler, who went before the Congress to expose Morgan's soliciting him to run a military coup to get FDR out of office.
This is an important point. We've made it before, Harley, but I just wanted to jump in. Well, there's 2 minutes and 50 seconds before break, so short segment, next segment's long. But Prescott Bush, right, the father to Bush Sr. and to our last Bush president, George W. Bush, Prescott Bush was part of that secret cabal who was involved with the Wall Street bankers in the attempted overthrow, a fascist coup of the U.S. government. That is all on the record, right? That's not conspiracy theory, is it, Harley?
No, on the record, and they're trying to get it off the record or keep it off the record, but it was congressional testimony from General Smedley Butler. Plus, on the Bush family bank, the Union Bank Corp of New York, was closed down by the Roosevelt government in 1942 under the Trading with the Enemy Act because they were continuing to fund Hitler as Americans were starting to die in North Africa fighting the Nazis. So this Bush family has a history of treason against the United States. Now, to take this Morgan question one step further, we got about 24 states now to introduce legislation supporting a national Glass-Steagall bill. One of those states was Delaware, where we had, I think it was 10 of the 21 members of the Senate signed on to the bill. And there was a Senate hearing on this. Now, this is just a simple memorial resolution. It has no real power except that it would show the growing support for Glass-Steagall. J.P. Morgan sent a lobbyist in there who essentially threatened the senators by saying, since Delaware is a state that has a lot of incorporation there because of its tax structure and so on, he said, do you know how many jobs the banks create in Delaware? 26,000. If you pass this bill, you could be jeopardizing those jobs. And one of the state senators said, are you threatening us? And he said, no, I'm just telling you the truth. So J.P. Morgan, in its own name, went into a state legislature to intimidate senators. And the one senator on the committee who was not a supporter, who gets a lot of money from bank lobbyists, shut down the hearing. So now, the other thing J.P. Morgan has done, and I'll be very quick with this, but it's important, they just wrote a memo a few months ago attacking the governments of Europe for having too much sovereignty. They called this a legacy of the post-World War II constitutional process. In other words, they wanted to go back to the pre-World War II constitutions, namely fascism, where people had no right and states had less sovereignty.
Before we went to break, we were talking about fascism, Harley, and we were talking about how states under this global mega banking empire, this fascist global banking government, states have less sovereignty. And we're seeing that in Spain. We're seeing that in Greece. We're seeing that in Italy. We're seeing that throughout Europe as these states are now beholden to the IMF and to the World Bank and to the marching orders of very powerful forces outside their own borders and outside the control of the people.
Sure, and I was talking about the Morgan memo, the J.P. Morgan memo on Europe, where they essentially attacked the idea that states would continue to carry out social safety nets, protection of labor, protection of local infrastructure. Look, there's a case in Germany right now, one of the most advanced countries in the world, which just had in the beginning of June terrible flooding because under the European Union environmental laws, you're not allowed to redredge rivers at the mouth. And so the rivers backed up, and the Elbe River, which normally flows into the North Sea, instead overflowed onto German farmland. And under the European Union restrictions and those adopted by the German government under these EU orders, the German people suffer. And now the government can't help them out with funds. And they're saying instead we should just let the rivers flow and people have to move somewhere else. So you have a combination of ridiculous environmental laws along with bureaucratic demands from the top. Now on banking, the Morgan report coincided with the Bank for International Settlements report, which said that nations have to stop propping up their economies and have to go with drastic austerity. Now, Greece has already had drastic austerity. Greece has almost 30% official unemployment. Spain has 25% official unemployment and over 50% for youth. But look, the United States is losing sovereignty as well in two ways. Number one, under President Obama, whose policies are directed by foreign powers, namely these international financial interests, is moving toward a dictatorship to the extent that he does not have any respect for the checks and balances of the constitutional system. We see this just with this ruling he made on Obamacare to do away with the executive mandate for a year. And Harkin, by the way, the liberal Democratic senator from Iowa, was the one who challenged Obama on this. He says, what right does the president have to overrule a congressional policy? Now, the policy itself, Obamacare, is no damn good. But once again, the president is doing what he wants over and above the Congress. And this is why we're starting to see bipartisan collaboration. And I'll bring up one example of that, a really good one. Senator Rand Paul and Senator Mike Lee, two real hard conservative Republicans, joined with Senator Murphy of Connecticut and Senator Udall of New Mexico, two what you might call liberal Democratic senators, to challenge the funding of the Syrian rebels or the Syrian terrorists as they really are.
Right.
And the Congress is moving to block that funding. Now here's the problem. The U.S. is already shipping arms through Saudi Arabia and Qatar and through Libya to these terrorists who are openly Al-Qaeda linked. So President Obama is not only supporting Al-Qaeda in Iraq inside Syria and Libyan Al-Qaeda inside Libya, but he is covertly and in some ways openly supporting the return of Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood to power in Egypt. And so again, you see the president taking for himself powers that he doesn't have under the Constitution and acting under a mandate that comes from this global banker dictatorship, which would prefer to have chaos in the Middle East, which doesn't threaten their powers. They would prefer to have a banker's dictatorship over Europe and over the United States.
I'm so glad you brought up this most concerning issue of the U.S. government arming and supporting the Syrian rebels or terrorists, which are essentially Al-Qaeda forces or Al-Qaeda-related forces, which are killing men, women, and children, Christians, doing all sorts of terrible, terrible crimes against humanity. And I wanted to ask you about Egypt as well. Okay, first of all, the people in Egypt are now pointing the finger, the collective people in Egypt, this is all over the internet, Yahoo News, etc. The people in Egypt are pointing the finger at Obama and saying, terrorism. Help us understand, is what happened in Egypt real? I think it's real. Or is it all part of this Zygmunt Brzezinski grand chessboard? And maybe, just maybe, the powers that be are getting what they want in Egypt, which is chaos. But I think this is a real move by the people to try to fight back. Am I right or am I wrong?
Well, the chaos is going to come if you try to impose these policies, because at a certain point, people will rebel against tyranny. At least you hope they would. And what we saw in Egypt was a recurring theme from what happened in the so-called Arab Spring. Remember, the Arab Spring was not about the Muslim Brotherhood. It was about people who were starving because of International Monetary Fund policies. And so you had millions turn out in Egypt. Mubarak was overthrown partly by those large crowds, but also by the withdrawal of U.S. support. Now, once the Muslim Brotherhood came in, Obama made it clear he was going to support them, even though Morsi used the democratic election as an excuse to carry out authoritarian measures, including the imposition of Sharia law. Now, the Egyptian people rebelled against that. Now, is there some element where you could say from the higher levels, chaos is what's desired? Well, the chaos is coming from the Muslim Brotherhood, not from the people of Egypt. And I think Americans should support what the people of Egypt demanded, which is that someone step in to stop the dictatorship that was being imposed in the name of Islam, which really isn't Islam in any case. Now, the deeper question here is that this is U.S. policy across the board. We supported the Libyan Islamic Shield, which is an Al-Qaeda-linked group to overthrow Gaddafi. We're supporting Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria, which is affiliated with Al-Qaeda. We're supporting the Saudis, who are pushing the most extreme Wahhabite jihadist Islam to create their own Islamic caliphate. And this is what there's a reaction against. Now, in this country, look, someone asked me the other day, what's the relationship between natural law and human rights and government? Isn't government always opposed to human rights? And my answer to that is simple. Human rights are innate. As it's stated in our Declaration of Independence, we are endowed by our Creator with inalienable rights. They don't come from a state. But throughout history, even though those human rights are innate in man's desire for freedom, most of history has been that of authoritarian, tyrannical regimes overpowering individuals. It was the American Revolution, as a consequence of some of the best people who left Europe because of the chaos in Europe, that came here and established a government that is in principle committed to defending those individual rights. But to do so, you have to give some power to a government. And the fight we've had in this country has always been over how much power. And at this point, I would say we're caught in a situation where the corporations and private interests are running the government. The government doesn't run the private interests. They're running the government. And the people have very little say. Either we do what's been done in Egypt, which is have at least a strong minority of the American people insist that we break the power of Obama, break these decrees, break this illegal, unconstitutional government, or we're going to lose everything. But in doing so, we don't want to throw out government. We want a government that's of, by, and for the people. That's the tradition of the United States. And that's why Glass-Steagall is important. That's why a credit policy is important. And that's why creating decent jobs and a real educational system and protecting seniors and the unemployed, that's part of what a government does do or should do.
That's right. Let me ask you something, Harley. For those who want to criticize us for speaking out about what we call criminality in government, and for speaking out on behalf of the Bill of Rights and Constitution and a return to a rule of law, which is what you're describing needs to be done, is it not patriotic just to merely submit to the will of the state? Shouldn't we just submit to the will of the state at this point and just mind our P's and Q's and just shut up, Harley?
Here's an interesting point that Edward Snowden made in his meeting yesterday with human rights groups in Moscow. He said that he's acting on the basis of the U.S. Constitution and the tribunal at Nuremberg after World War II that said you do not submit to national laws if those national laws are wrong. Now, the argument that Obama has, which is that everything that's been done with the spying is legal because we have a law that allows it. First of all, that's not entirely true. They've stretched the original FISA law much beyond its original you can't even recognize it from its original intent. But secondly, suppose a law is passed which violates human rights. For example, I think you could take Snowden's argument and say, well, Hitler passed laws that allowed him to exterminate people. He passed laws that allowed him to be a dictator. Does that mean that you should submit and accept that as law? And I think this is really the important question. You know, when you look at the world today, most people know there's a lot that's wrong. I mean, whether it's the spying, whether it's the fact that we're destroying agricultural land in the United States, that we have no water policy in this country, that we have a fascist healthcare system that's been imposed by Obamacare that's not going to work, it's going to kill people. People know there's something wrong. Now, speaking out against it, even if you don't have the answer, is actually a defense of the tradition and legacy of our Constitution. Our American Revolution, technically, was against the law, wasn't it? We had to fight the British who had said it was their legal right to tell the colonies what to do. And our founding fathers said, no, that's a violation of our natural rights. And so I think that's where you get to this question that you never submit to arbitrary power, especially when there are clear guidelines of an alternative approach.
We can embrace the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, and I mean, what an incredible document, the Declaration, too, to say that, you know, our rights are given to us by our Creator and not a man. And because we get our natural-born rights from our Creator, no man can take away those rights. And yet, here we are, with the will of the state being that in the name of a war on terror which is endless, they need to take away our liberties piece by piece by piece by piece, in return with this pretense, this offer, this hollow offer of providing us security. And if you give up your liberty for security, you will get neither. We have a minute before we go to break. Your response?
That's where we are right now. We don't have security. I mean, is Al-Qaeda done with its wars? There's more chaos in the Middle East that will spill over into Europe and the United States now than before 9/11. So we've given up a whole bunch of our security, or our liberties rather, but we don't have security. We don't have security from Obama. This is a president who, if he were Richard Nixon, he would have been out of office by now. And the problem is that the Democrats up to this point have supported him out of fear, And the Republicans, many of them are allowing him to do this out of opportunism, that if he makes things worse, it will help the Republicans in 2014 and 2016. That kind of opportunism is how nations disintegrate and die.
I'll tell you what, guys, if you want to start working on your PhD in economics and history, just listen to all of my past interviews with Harley on YouTube. Harley, I wanted to ask you something. We were talking briefly before we went to break. I said that I was going to ask you about, the LaRouche history. Are you Democrats, are you Republicans? It doesn't really matter to me because I've broken that false right paradigm. And here's the way I see it. I compare LaRouche and what you folks are doing there to being in the Ron Paul tradition. I would compare LaRouche, if he's a Democrat, much more to the JFK tradition of what a Democrat is. And by today's comparison, JFK was much more conservative and libertarian in his beliefs and what he stood for than Lindsey Graham and John McCain, who identify themselves as Republican, are today.
Well, even if you look at the Republican Party, where people call themselves Reaganites, most of them have no real sense of what Reagan actually represented. See, I think there's a tradition in this country which LaRouche has identified as the patriotic tradition. It goes back to the founding fathers. It goes back to the Lincoln tradition in the Republican Party, the Whig tradition, that the Republicans deviated from after World War I. The Democrats, who had been the slave party up through World War I with Franklin Roosevelt, changed and went back. People say Roosevelt was a socialist, a left liberal. He actually was taking his lead from Alexander Hamilton and George Washington in his economic policies, the founding fathers. And that Kennedy tradition that you talk about, that's the tradition that I look to in the Democratic Party, along with the Lincoln tradition in the Republican Party. And you can have a coherence of interest. In fact, Sean, I would even say, if you look at at least elements of it, the Occupy Wall Street and Tea Party, what people were rebelling against were two things. One, the sense that people no longer have a say in government. And two, that special interests are being bailed out to the tunes of trillions, while the working people and middle class are losing ground, are being looted, are being left out of loans and credit policy. And that there you find the majority of the American people still have in their DNA the sense of justice and fairness and individual liberty that comes from our Constitution, which is not reflected in either of the main parties today in the way they govern. Now, we're seeing a slight change, and you've been instrumental in bringing these ideas to the Libertarian and Ron Paul networks. You see people on the Democratic side, like Senator Wyden, a liberal Democrat from Oregon, who's fighting as much as he can against the Obama police state. I think there's an element in this country that wants a change, but they're afraid to break with the power of the media and public opinion, which is shaped by that. And so those of us who have the courage to speak the truth have to look for similar thoughts in other people, even if they are in different parties, different factions, and look to principle above party,
right,
nation above special interest.
Right.
And that's what LaRouche has been trying to do for years. And I think we're now at a point where the crisis is so profound that there are people being driven to that, even if they don't like it.
Right. Well, the fascism is so obvious, and for people who don't know what that word means, Mussolini described it as the marriage between corporations and government. We see it with Monsanto. We see it across the board with NSA wiretapping and forcing companies or getting companies to willingly give up personal information. And so when you talk about this patriotic tradition, I love that. We just want to reinstate constitutional law. We just want a return to liberty. We want a return to what made America great. That's all we want. We're not conspiracy theorists. We're not, we don't want a revolution, an armed revolution. We want a return to rule of law. We want the things that will preserve our natural human rights. And we have 1 minute and 30 seconds before we lose you, Harley. The show's almost over. Can't believe how fast it went. I can't thank you time. You've always been so incredibly generous. In this minute we have left, is there any final words you want to leave for our audience?
Yeah, we've got to fight. And people can't give in to the sense that you can't win. We can win. because the enemy is bankrupt and they're intellectually dishonest and immoral. And to submit to them is to give up your own humanity. Now, I'd urge people to go to my website, the LaRouchePAC.com website, to get updates on this. And I'll do what I always do with you. I'll give my office number here, a toll-free number. If people want to talk to me, they can call 800-922-2907. I've had a chance to talk to a lot of your listeners, Sean, and I find them most interested in trying to save the country. So 800-922-2907. Call and ask for me, and I'll be glad to call you back because time is short.
Well, you guys want solutions? Harley Schlanger and the folks at LaRouche are really working on finding solutions. Harley, thank you so much for your time. We love you, man.
My pleasure, Sean. Talk to you soon.
All right, guys, thanks for joining us on Unbound Radio. Check out unboundradio.com for all of the latest information and fantastic hosts across the board 24/7. Have a great day.